I have some unsolicited opinions about the film Hereditary. Hi, hello, hi. This is me, this is my ugly mug. I'm trying something a bit new and different here. I have a more long-form, traditional video essay on the way, but it got content ID'd before it was done uploading, so got to do something about that. I've never done a vlog or anything like this before, but the basic idea behind this video is to give sort of unsolicited script doctor advice about a film I enjoyed but think had some strange moments in it. If you don't know, I worked as a script editor a while back and have continued to do so freelance when I had the opportunity. It's honestly work that I really enjoy and find quite rewarding, so with that out of the way, let's get on with our diagnosis. I think that's about as much as I can torture this metaphor. Hereditary is a genuinely wonderful and atmospheric film. It's been likened to The Witch and The Babadook, a comparison I understand but think is a little insulting because when people say that, they tend to just mean it's a good horror movie. The film does a lot of things spectacularly well, in my opinion, mostly character work. The central figures of the film are fantastically fleshed out and believable human beings, and I never once questioned why they were doing anything they were doing. I thought the film was an incredibly effective examination of a kind of looming sickness, for lack of a better term, of guilt and blame that is constantly lingering over this family, the unease and terror that comes with the idea that something has been irrevocably broken, that the life they foresaw for themselves is now no longer possible, and everyone knows that, but facing it, and especially facing why things are the way they are, is too hard, so everyone sort of goes on in this entombed, queasy, distant malaise where the only break comes from the misery that clarity brings. And then it becomes about summoning a fucking demon? Okay, look, I know what you're thinking, and no, my problem with the movie actually isn't to do with the plot twist, if you can really call it that. It's a plot point that's actually set up fairly well early on in the movie, with a lot of hints and breadcrumbs leading there. Grandma wishing Charlie had been born a boy, the mother saying she wasn't able to have a miscarriage if it's like a magic baby or whatever, Charlie being the granny's favourite. They're not huge clues, but they're enough that it doesn't feel like the plot point comes out of nowhere at the end. Rather, the thing that bothered me most about the sudden shift of the demonic aspect of the film to the forefront in the final half hour was, for my money, that it came at the expense of a number of genuinely more interesting threads that had been previously set up. Towards the end of the film, it feels like Hereditary is a person who cuts themselves off mid-sentence as they have another thought. You see, there's this seed germinating in the film that I kept waiting to see grow and come to fruition, and that's the mother's fear that she, or perhaps her genes, are to blame for the misfortune that's befalling her family. The film is called Hereditary, after all. This would, funnily enough, make it kind of similar to The Babadook in the idea of it being a horror about something relatable. In The Babadook, the fear you might not love your kids, but viewed through a supernatural lens. In Hereditary, we hear all about Annie's mother's rough life. We hear about how Annie's father starved himself to death, how her brother suffered from schizophrenia and hung himself, and how her mother had DID and eventually developed dementia and ceased to be herself towards the end of her life. There's a really great disdain and air of unease that other characters have when they talk about Granny. She's a really well done example, I think, of a corpse running the show trope. Annie herself also suffers from sleepwalking and episodes of some kind. Maybe it's the early stages of DID, it's not really gone into specifically. In one sleepwalking spell, she nearly kills herself and her kids, and there's this lingering idea throughout the film of, oh god, did I pass it on to them? Are they screwed because of me? Are they going to suffer because of me? Because my husband is fine, he's stable, but my family, they're the ones with all the problems. What have I done to my kids? And that kind of leads to this sort of background resentment she has towards them because they're a reflection of this darkness that she thinks is inside her. The counselling session she goes to early on in the film ends with someone asking, well, what do you think you're to blame for? And she doesn't even want to say. That's probably why she even tried to have a miscarriage in the first place, because she was afraid of passing this dark thing onto her children. The idea that mental illness is a horrible fate outside of the character's control is also hinted at very subtly when fictional characters in a story are in a classroom discussing how tragic it is when fictional characters in a story don't have control over their own fate. As a brief aside, I really love scenes in a classroom where characters are studying storytelling or history, because I get to just sit back and go, oh, the movie's going to tell me what it's about now. But anyway, the idea of mental illness being a curse that's passed down. This is an idea I kept expecting to be the whole point of the film. It makes sense, right? I mean, there's one scene where Annie angrily stands up and says, no one ever accepts responsibility for anything in this family, and Peter brings up her own mistakes and she leaves, and this felt like it was setting up a cathartic moment for me, but it never comes back. And Peter's guilt too, that's portrayed in really wonderful moments in the film, like seeing the car mirror in class, or freaking out when he gets high, or seeing Charlie in his room, and maybe he makes the clicking sound because he actually is suffering from some kind of hereditary mental illness, and the guilt is causing him to act out in that specific way. Maybe Annie knows that there's this thing that's dormant in him, and she made him take Charlie to the party, and then she died, and because of that, she's losing both of her children. This all feels like it's setting up some kind of confrontation or conversation between the two characters when they're at the most tense and most under pressure moment, but no. Peter bangs his head on the table and she saws her fucking head off, and the last conversation these two characters have is so inconsequential, I can't remember what they're talking about. So if you can see what I'm getting at, my problem with Hereditary isn't the King Paimon stuff. It really, really isn't. It's that in order to get there, the film sweeps aside a lot of interesting stuff it sets up earlier on. The horror at the end isn't bad. In fact, it's actually fairly effective, I think. It's just, by that point, the film doesn't feel special anymore. I think Hereditary's largest successes are perhaps best emblemized by the scene where Peter kills Charlie and he gets home and he hears his parents are awake, and you can hear them say, oh good, they're home, and he doesn't have the strength to tell them what happened, so he just goes to bed. And there's this shot of Peter's face as the camera zooms in, and he has this 1,000-yard stare, and you can tell he's counting down the seconds until his parents find out, and then you hear it happen. And that, honestly, that entire sequence where you see her body and the funeral, and that shot in particular, that genuinely disturbed me. It made me feel sick and uncomfortable. That's what I'm going to remember about Hereditary. I'm not going to remember scary mum chases her kid around the house and yells. I mean, maybe I would have remembered a scene where Annie, screaming and crying, sees what's becoming of her last remaining kid and pleads desperately for forgiveness, but is so ashamed and hysterical, Peter doesn't even know what she's asking to be forgiven for, and Annie realizes, oh my god, it's happened to me, I'm just like my mother, as all of this crazy demonic stuff goes down. And you know, I had this idea that from the first seance, the spirit that is haunting the film wasn't actually Charlie, it was Grandma, the one who had DID and dementia. And the movie was going to be about this actual manifestation of Annie's fear, this manifestation of mental illness and strife and pain and misery intruding violently and aggressively onto the lives of the characters. Honestly, that's what I thought was going to happen, and I would have liked that, but when the King Paimon stuff came up, I was actually more intrigued because I thought those ideas would tie in together, but really one just supplants the other. The movie ends with something that is called a contrapuntal score. Essentially, it's very tonally inappropriate music. Think the torture scene from Reservoir Dogs. But the thing is, I left the cinema and the question on my mind was, why did they decide to do that? End with a cheesy pop song. What was it meant to make me feel? And the only thing I can really think of is that the last scene in the movie where everyone's bowing towards Peter and everything is so different than everything else that's come in the movie, that's so, I hate to say it, silly, that if they tried to play it straight, it would come across as even goofier. In the end, Hereditary is a film that ends up feeling like it has amnesia. Like it forgets its strongest and best qualities in favour of being something else, when the truth is, it can be both and not lose anything that makes it special. So, that was my diagnosis, and now let's get on to my prescription. Before we get on to major concerns and major changes I would make, I just want to address a couple of little nitpicks. Sorry. So if you want the Paimon Demon King stuff, I would maybe actually have one of the members of the school or someone at the party or someone who has some kind of influence over Peter's life or the accident in particular be in the scene where he's being crowned and everyone's bowing down to him. It would tie things together a lot. I know you want to have the shared blame between Peter and Annie. That's great. It makes sense. But the forced to take to party, then cake, then reaction, then Peter's high a bit, then they're going fast and they don't have the EpiPen, and she sticks her head out the window and then she hits her head. Like, it's not crazy, but it's a bit weird and a bit convenient for the murder cult that she just happened to die when they needed her to. I would maybe change the death scene entirely so that the accident is still an accident, or still can be viewed as an accident that's both Annie and Peter's fault, but that the death cult somehow had some influence over it. Not something where it's obvious in the moment that they have some kind of input, but something that upon rewatch would make sense and would also technically mean these elements are introduced earlier on in the film. Okay, moving on. I'm going to prescribe an extra scene between Peter and Annie. Before she goes full possessed and Peter ends up in the attic, some kind of scene that ties up several loose thematic points. Maybe she admits there's this dark thing inside her and everything is her fault, to which Peter assures her, no, this is an external terror. None of this misfortune comes from inside her, that they can each forgive each other even though they don't really know what to forgive each other for. I admit that if you want to have a sort of more positive thematic bow tied up, it would maybe lose its punch if Annie still dies and goes crazy. Maybe you could even go a darker route where Annie realizes all of this dark, terrible stuff that's inside her, and maybe it's her fault in a more literal way that she could have impacted. Maybe she never told Peter and he could have gotten medicated or could have gone to therapy or something, but she was too afraid of the reality. I would also maybe pepper in a few more mentions of Grandma throughout the film, make her presence a kind of constant thing so the audience doesn't forget her. Again, honestly, I thought the twist was going to be that they summoned the ghost of Granny rather than Charlie. You know, that she was just someone who hated seeing her daughter happy, or maybe even the incredibly fucked up reveal that she's still got dementia and DID as a ghost. I actually don't know how I feel about her being this venerated figure in the cult at the end, because a horrible relative you can't do anything about, but also feel some lingering affection towards and are forced to help out and take care of, is a much more relatable, affecting, and disturbing thing than Granny's an evil devil. I know they were estranged, but Granny never thought to say, hey, daughter, do you want to live forever with King Paimon too? That actually brings me to Joan, who I think is a character that you could use and repurpose a bit to smooth over a lot of stuff in the story. I would perhaps posit that Joan could be related to the family in some way, a sister that Grandma never mentioned, or a long-forgotten aunt or something. It would actually make a lot of sense for how they know each other and how willing she is to help out Granny. And it would also kind of make for a interesting late movie reveal. I mean, as is, it's a bit strange because we don't know anything about the relationship. How could she arrange and communicate this whole convoluted devil plan with Joan if she ended up being bedridden with dementia? Joan never came by to check up whether the evil plan was going okay. Also, it would explain how Joan could perhaps get into their house and hide the body up there, or whatever. Anyway, those are a few off-the-cuff thoughts on the film. I only saw it yesterday. I'll probably have more to say and really regret putting this up. But I'd love to hear what you think. Am I completely off about Hereditary? Has a plot point or a thematic thing gone completely over my head? Please tell me. If you enjoyed this video, I might consider doing a few more, maybe on specific films, but maybe just stuff about script doctoring. Horror stories I've had, editing scripts, or anything you guys might be interested in. Writing advice, let me know. Thanks for watching. And like, share, and subscribe. Oh my god, I have no personality.